Our before each statement is looking pretty good. We have our list of accounts and we have deployed a factory. We had created these two extra variables as well. So let's now talk about why we made these. The purpose of this campaign test file is to eventually test our campaigns, right? Yeah, we want to test the factory inside of here as well, but mostly we probably want to test a campaign. It probably makes sense that almost every single test that we're going to end up writing is probably going to end up needing an instance of a campaign. So rather than using the factory inside of every it statement to create a separate instance of a campaign, I think that we should probably just make one campaign from the get-go inside the before each, and then we will have it available inside of every other it statement inside this file. So it's going to save us a lot of typing from having to constantly use the factory to make an instance of the campaign. So with that in mind, maybe the purpose of these two variables is a little bit more clear. We're going to now use the factory to create an instance of a campaign and assign it to the campaign variable. We'll also take the address of that thing and assign it to the campaign address variable as well. Okay, so let's get to it. So we're going to use the factory to make an instance of a campaign. So inside the before each, at the very bottom, we're going to call the create campaign function on our factory that we just made right here. Of course, anytime we call a function, it's always going to be asynchronous. So we're going to make sure that we lead off with the await keyword. We'll then reference factory.methods, and specifically we want to call the create campaign function. So we'll say create campaign, like so. Remember that create campaign requires exactly one argument. It's supposed to be the amount of money that is going to be the minimum contribution. So here's my campaign factory. Here's the create campaign function. We are expected to pass in the minimum contribution. So for the purposes of this test, I don't want to have to deal a whole bunch with dealing of conversion between way and ether or anything like that. So I'm going to say that the minimum contribution is going to be simply 100 way. Again, you'll see that I'm representing a number here as a string. I know that we still have not quite gone into great detail on why that is, but certainly on this application that we're going to work on in just a little bit, it'll be a lot obvious why we're using the string here. So we call create campaign, we place our one set of parentheses, and then don't forget we have to also specify whether or not we are doing a call or a send to this function. In this case, we are trying to modify data inside of our contract. Heck, we're trying to deploy a new contract. So without a doubt, this is going to be sending a transaction because we're trying to modify some data on the blockchain. So I'm going to say .send, and then we're going to specify who is sending this transaction and the amount of gas to use. So the person sending the transaction, just like before, we'll say it is accounts at 0. So accounts at 0 is going to be the manager of this campaign. Then we'll also specify our gas. And for that, we'll again do 1 million. All right, so this definitely creates the campaign right here, but we do not actually have a reference to the campaign. Remember, anytime we call send, or anytime we send a transaction, we get absolutely no result back, except for a transaction receipt. So we have absolutely no idea what address the campaign was just created at. That is exactly why we had created that other function on the campaign factory. So here's campaign factory. You'll recall that we made the get deployed campaigns function. And this is how we get access to any of the campaigns that have been created with the factory. So in order to get access to the campaign that was just made, we have to call that function and read off the address. So on the next line down below, we're going to call the get deployed campaigns method off of the factory.methods object. As usual, yep, it's asynchronous, so don't forget to put down the await keyword. By the way, at this point, could you even possibly imagine doing this without async await? That just kind of occurred to me right now. Could you imagine if we were using callbacks for all this stuff, or if we were using promises even? I can't even remotely imagine writing this code using promises, let alone callbacks. That would be so awful. Anyways, back on topic. So we're going to use factory.methods, and I want to get the big listing of all of our deployed campaigns. So I'm going to call get deployed campaigns. When we call this function, it is a view function. Remember, we labeled it as being a view function. So here is get deployed campaigns. It's view. View means that we are not changing any data. And since we're not changing any data, we're going to call this function as opposed to sending a transaction to it. So this call right here is going to return an array of addresses, a big array. And it's going to have all the different addresses that we have for our deployed campaigns. Now we could certainly do something like, I don't know, const addresses, and then say like, remember we have this variable up here, campaign address, and as you might imagine, we want to stuff the deployed address into this variable right here. So we could say something like campaign address is addresses at 0. Because this is going to return an array, we've only deployed one campaign, so we probably can assume that the one that we just deployed will be at index of 0 in that array. So if you want to, you can definitely write this line of code. Or we could be really fancy and use a little bit of ES 2015. Actually, this might be ES 2016 syntax. So you can do this if you want. Alternatively, we can delete the const addresses right here and replace it with square brackets campaign address, like so. So this is a little bit of destructuring from an array. We're saying that we want to take the first element out of the array that is returned by this thing and assign it to the campaign address variable. We are specifically taking out the first element because we are placing these square brackets right here. The square brackets tell JavaScript, hey, the thing that's being returned right here is going to be an array. Take the first element out of that and assign it to the variable campaign address. So again, this is a little bit of optional syntax if you want to get a little bit fancy. Okay, so now that we've got the campaign address, the next thing we have to do is create our actual instance of the campaign. So remember, the campaign actually exists on our local blockchain at this point, after running all the code that you see inside of here. Like there's some address, the contract exists there. And the address that it's at is campaign address right here. So now we need to write a little bit of code that's going to instruct Web3 to create a JavaScript representation of the contract, and that representation needs to be kind of operating against or trying to access the contract that exists at this address. Okay, so to do that, we're going to assign the result of this operation to the campaign variable. So eventually campaign will be the actual contract that we're dealing with. So I'm going to say campaign is await new web3.eth.contract. Again, make sure you're using lowercase w, capital C. And then inside of here, we're going to pass in two separate arguments. First, we're going to pass in the interface or the ABI for our compiled campaign, just like we did a little bit ago with our factory right here. So the ABI for our campaign is on the interface property of compiled campaign. Just as before, this is JSON, so we need to parse that JSON before we pass it into this function. So as the first argument, we'll say json.parse compiled campaign.interface. And then as the second argument, we're going to pass in the address of where this campaign exists. So I'll pass in campaign address, like so. Notice how these two contract calls right here are slightly different. So we've been using this type of statement right here constantly throughout the course. We use this form right here where we do not specify an address whenever we want to deploy a new version of this contract. However, if we've already deployed the contract and we want to instruct Web3 about its existence, that's where we pass in the interface as the first argument, and then we pass in the address of the already deployed version as the second argument. So because this thing has already been deployed, we obviously do not have to execute the .deploy or the .send steps right here. All right, so I think that's it for our before each helper. I know there's a lot of code that went into there, but we're all done now. And at least we don't have to constantly replace or redo this logic right here inside of every single it block. So if we had not been assuming that, yeah, we probably need an instance of a campaign inside of every test, we would have had to like basically reproduce this code all over the place. And that, of course, would have been very annoying. All right, let's take a break here. We're going to continue in the next video where we're going to write out our first test. And then we're going to make sure that all this stuff works. So I'll see you in just a minute.